He thought the past stayed buried until it showed up on national television and looked nothing like he remembered it. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Whitmore Enterprises was quiet in that controlled, expensive way, where every surface reflected success and every silence felt intentional. David Anderson sat at the head of the table with a polished confidence, a tablet in one hand and a morning briefing in the other, while city light poured through the glass walls behind him like a backdrop designed for certainty. No one spoke until the screen on the wall shifted from financial charts to a live broadcast, and in that instant the room's atmosphere changed without a single word being said. On the screen, Jessica Miller stood in front of a modest food truck painted in clean, simple colors, the kind of ordinary setup that should have been invisible in a city that worshipped scale, yet everything about her presence demanded attention. She wore no performance of wealth, no attempt to match the polished world David had built around himself, only calm composure shaped by time, resilience, and something quieter than pride. The reporter beside her introduced her story as another example of unexpected success, but the words barely mattered because David had already stopped listening. His attention locked onto her face as if the years between them had collapsed into a single frame of reality he could not edit. Jessica spoke calmly into the microphone, her voice steady as she explained how she started with only $300, how she built something small enough to survive and strong enough to grow, and how she learned to rebuild a life that had once been taken apart without her consent. Around her, the city moved in the background, but she did not look like someone being overwhelmed by it anymore. She looked like someone who had already learned how to move with it. David's assistant shifted slightly beside him, sensing the change in the room, but no one dared interrupt the screen because the broadcast carried a weight that was not just informational, it was personal. Jessica continued speaking about long days, early mornings, and the decision to start again when starting again felt impossible, but what struck David most was not what she said, it was what she did not say. There was no anger in her tone, no reference to the past, no need to explain what had already been left behind. The camera zoomed in slightly as she smiled at a customer handing over a tray of food, and in that moment something subtle but irreversible tightened in David's expression. This was not the version of her he had stored in memory, not the version that once stood quietly in the background of his life. This was someone else entirely, someone the world had decided to notice. The anchor's voice returned, mentioning that Jessica Miller's food truck had now expanded into multiple locations across the city and had recently been featured in a national segment highlighting emerging entrepreneurs. But David no longer heard the details, because all he could register was the simple fact that she was visible now in a way that no longer required his permission. The room remained still, executives pretending to refocus on their devices, but the truth was unavoidable. Something had shifted, not in the broadcast, but in the balance of everything David thought he had already closed. And as the screen continued to show Jessica speaking to the camera with quiet confidence, David realized that the past he believed he had left behind had not disappeared at all, it had only grown into something he no longer recognized. The first wave of silence inside that glass-walled conference room did not last long, because silence in a place like that always gets replaced by something heavier, something that forces attention to settle in uncomfortable places. David Anderson remained seated, but his posture had subtly changed, as if the screen in front of him had introduced a variable he could not immediately calculate. Around him, executives pretended to return to their tablets and laptops, yet no one was truly working anymore, because the broadcast still lingered in the air like an unfinished sentence. Outside the glass, the city kept moving in its usual rhythm, yellow taxis crossing intersections, office workers walking with coffee in hand, but inside the room, Time felt slightly misaligned, as if one moment had stretched too long and refused to close properly. Jessica Miller's image had already faded from the main screen, replaced by a rotating segment of local news updates, yet her presence remained anchored in the room, not as a memory, but as an unresolved fact. David finally leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose in a controlled motion that suggested he was trying to restore order to his thoughts, but order did not return in the way he expected. His assistant placed a document in front of him, something related to a midday investor briefing, but he barely registered it, his attention still partially caught in the moment that had just passed. Jessica's voice replayed in fragments inside his mind, not the exact words, but the structure of them, the calm certainty of someone describing a life rebuilt without permission or apology. It was not anger that unsettled him, it was the absence of it, because absence meant distance, and distance meant loss of control over a narrative he assumed was finished. One of the executives finally cleared his throat softly, attempting to steer the meeting forward with a comment about market projections, but the attempt felt fragile, like a thread pulled through fabric that had already begun to loosen. David nodded once, signaling acknowledgement, but his focus shifted to his phone as a notification appeared, unrelated at first glance, a scheduled update from media monitoring services tracking public appearances of emerging food businesses. He almost ignored it, until he saw her name again, attached to a second headline confirming expansion into a second food truck location in downtown Brooklyn. The detail should have been minor in the context of everything else in his day, yet it landed differently, not because of its scale, but because of its direction. Expansion implied momentum, and momentum implied continuation, something still moving forward without his involvement. Across the table, no one commented, but subtle changes in posture began to appear, people adjusting chairs, glancing toward the screen as if expecting it to return to relevance. David set the phone down, but did not fully let go of it, his hand resting near it as though proximity could stabilize whatever shift he was beginning to feel. In his mind, he tried to reframe the situation, to place it back into a category he understood, something like coincidence or temporary attention from media cycles, but the frame would not hold. Instead, another thought surfaced uninvited, the memory of Jessica years earlier, standing quietly in a kitchen that once belonged to both of them, writing down plans on paper that he had barely looked at the time. Back then, it had seemed small, almost irrelevant compared to the trajectory he believed he was on, but now that memory carried a different weight, because it suggested continuity where he had assumed absence. The executive meeting resumed around him, voices returning to structured topics, revenue forecasts, operational timelines, acquisition strategies, yet David found himself listening without absorbing, as if part of his attention had stepped outside the room and was still standing in front of that television screen. And somewhere beneath the polished language of quarterly growth and projected returns, a quieter realization began forming, not fully defined, but impossible to ignore, that certain stories do not end when they are dismissed. They simply continue elsewhere until they become visible again at a time when no one is prepared to interpret them. The moment David Anderson stepped out of the conference room, the city outside felt unusually loud, as if every sound had been turned up one level higher than necessary. The hallway outside Whitmore Enterprises stretched long and reflective, lined with glass panels that mirrored his movements and fragments, but he barely noticed them as he walked with measured pace toward his office. His schedule for the afternoon was already prepared, carefully structured blocks of investor communication, internal strategy alignment, and a private call with legal counsel, yet none of it registered with the same clarity it normally would. Instead, his attention remained partially trapped in the earlier broadcast, not in its content alone, but in the emotional disruption it had created without warning. When he entered his office, the door closed behind him with a soft mechanical sound that usually marked control, but today it felt more like separation. He placed his tablet on the desk, but did not open it immediately, instead standing still for a moment while the skyline beyond the window remained unchanged, indifferent to his internal shift. Across the city, Jessica Miller was no longer on television, yet her presence continued to expand through digital spaces, clips being shared, reposted, and discussed in ways that extended far beyond the original broadcast. Her food truck, once a small physical space in a single neighborhood, was now being mapped across multiple online platforms, with reviews, locations, and customer stories forming a growing pattern of visibility that could no longer be contained to one moment. In a modest commercial lot in Brooklyn, Jessica stood behind the counter of her food truck, preparing orders with steady focus, her movements calm and deliberate, shaped by repetition rather than urgency. The space around her was simple, metal counters, warm lighting, the sound of small conversations from customers waiting nearby, yet there was an underlying shift in atmosphere that came from recognition rather than attention. People were beginning to arrive not just for food, but because they had seen her face, heard her story, and wanted to experience the place that had quietly become part of a larger narrative. She did not respond differently to it, her behavior remained consistent, measured, grounded, as if visibility was not a destination but just another condition to move through. Back in the high-rise office, David finally sat down, opening his tablet as financial reports and internal updates populated the screen. But even as numbers and projections filled his field of view, His mind kept returning to something less structured, the image of Jessica speaking on television with the same calm tone she used now when speaking to customers. There was no trace of performance in either version of her, which made it harder for him to categorize what he was witnessing. A notification appeared on his screen, this time from an internal research team tracking consumer sentiment around emerging small business brands, and Jessica Miller's name appeared again, attached to a growing list of engagement metrics that suggested rapid expansion beyond local recognition. I read the figures once, then again, as if repetition might restore distance, but the data only reinforced what was already becoming clear: this was no longer a single-story moment, it was a continuing trajectory. In another part of the city, a producer from a morning television segment reached out for a follow-up feature, noting increased viewer interest and unexpected audience engagement, a detail that would have normally been insignificant to David, yet now it carried weight because it confirmed that what he had seen was not isolated. As the afternoon progressed, David attempted to redirect his focus into scheduled work, but each time he tried, small reminders of Jessica's presence in the public space reappeared, not aggressively, but persistently, through headlines, through social mentions, through internal summaries that quietly updated in the background of his attention. At one point, he paused mid-review of a contract, realizing that he had been reading the same paragraph for several minutes without processing its meaning. He set the document down and looked again toward the city, not searching for anything specific, but as if expecting the skyline itself might offer a clearer interpretation of what was unfolding. Yet the city remained unchanged, steady, indifferent, continuing its movement without acknowledgement of the internal shift taking place within one man who believed he had already closed that chapter of his life. And somewhere beneath the structured language of business updates and performance reports, a quieter realization continued forming, that distance does not erase outcomes, and what grows in silence often becomes visible at the exact moment it can no longer be ignored. The afternoon in the city had shifted into a slower rhythm, but inside David Anderson's office the sense of time felt increasingly fragmented, as if each passing minute was being measured against something he could not directly see yet could no longer ignore. He remained seated at his desk, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass like a distant system operating independently of his attention, while internal notifications continued to populate his screen in quiet succession. Reports, updates, and scheduled summaries appeared in their usual structured format, but David found himself reading them twice, not because they were complex, but because his focus kept drifting back to the same underlying interruption that had followed him since the morning broadcast. Jessica Miller's presence had transitioned from a single televised moment into a pattern of continuous visibility, not loud, not disruptive, but steadily expanding across platforms that tracked public engagement. At first, he had treated it as coincidence, a brief resurgence of attention around an old story, yet by the time the third update appeared on his system, that explanation no longer held its shape. The update referenced a regional feature segment scheduled for later in the week, highlighting small business growth stories across New York City, and her name was listed again among the primary profiles being followed by media analysts. David leaned slightly forward, his fingers resting on the edge of the desk as he processed the implication without immediately naming it in his mind. This was no longer about a single appearance or isolated recognition. It was continuity. In Brooklyn, Jessica stood inside her food truck as the late afternoon line slowly extended down the sidewalk, each customer moving forward with a sense of calm anticipation that had become routine in this part of the city. She moved with practiced efficiency, preparing orders, acknowledging customers with brief but genuine attention, her focus remaining grounded in the present rather than the attention surrounding her. A small camera crew had arrived earlier, setting up discreetly near the corner of the lot, preparing for a follow-up segment, but she did not alter her behavior in response to it. The environment around her had changed in visibility, not in structure. Everything she did remained consistent with the same quiet discipline she had built from the beginning, but now there was a layer of external perception that followed her actions without requiring her participation. Back in the office tower, David opened a live market overview dashboard, expecting distraction through data, yet instead finding indirect references embedded within consumer engagement analytics. Jessica Miller's name appeared again, not as headline content this time, but as part of a trend analysis indicating rising brand recognition within urban food service markets. The system did not present it emotionally, it presented it structurally, as a measurable pattern of expansion, and that was what made it harder to dismiss. It closed one window, then another, as if reducing visual input might reduce cognitive pressure, but the pattern persisted across different layers of information. At one point, a colleague entered briefly to discuss a pending acquisition review, but David responded with delayed attention, his focus only partially present in the conversation. After the colleague left, he remained still, staring at the edge of the desk where his tablet lay untouched, realizing that his internal sense of control was no longer aligned with the external flow of information surrounding her. The realization did not arrive as a single conclusion. It accumulated gradually, through repetition, through presence, through the simple fact that Jessica Miller was no longer contained within memory or isolated media moments. She was now part of an ongoing system of visibility that continued to grow without interruption. Outside, the city lights began to shift as evening approached, and the reflection of the skyline returned faintly across the glass surface of his office, layering the present over something he could no longer fully separate from the past. And in that overlap, David understood without fully verbalizing it that what he had once dismissed as finished had not only continued, it had evolved beyond the boundaries he had assumed would contain it. As evening settled deeper over the city, the lights outside David Anderson's office began to form a dense grid of motion and reflection, but inside the room everything felt increasingly still, as if the external world had slowed. Used enough for his thoughts to become louder than usual. He remained seated at his desk, no longer actively reviewing documents, but also not fully disengaged, caught in a suspended state where attention drifted between present responsibilities and the unresolved pattern that had been building throughout the day. The system notifications on his screen continued to refresh at regular intervals, each update appearing with the same neutral formatting, yet none of them felt neutral anymore in his perception. Reports about market activity, internal project timelines, and scheduled investor communications were all still there, but they no longer carried the same weight of priority. Instead, his focus kept returning to a quieter stream of information that was not part of any formal report, the expanding visibility of Jessica Miller across multiple channels that he had not previously associated with her. It was no longer just media coverage. It had become repetition across platforms, repetition that implied continuity, and continuity that implied stability outside of his influence. In Brooklyn, Jessica finished serving the last customers of the evening rush, the food truck now quieter as the line slowly disappeared into the surrounding streets. She wiped down the counter with steady movements, not rushed, not distracted, maintaining the same composed rhythm she had carried throughout the entire day. A small television mounted in the corner of the truck played a muted evening news segment, and her own image briefly appeared again, this time referencing local business growth trends and community impact stories, but she did not react to it. For her, the work remained physical and immediate: orders, preparation, organization, while the attention surrounding her existed at a distance she did not need to engage with directly. Yet even at this distance, there was a shift in environment that could no longer be ignored: customers who returned not only for food but for familiarity with her presence, conversations that lingered slightly longer, and a subtle recognition that had begun to shape the space around her without altering her behavior. Back in the office tower, David received another notification, this time from a private market analysis summary prepared by his advisory team, highlighting unexpected growth in independent food service brands that had recently gained national exposure. Jessica Miller's name appeared again within the report, not as a headline, but as a comparative data point showing accelerated engagement across urban consumer demographics. He stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because the information was complex, but because it continued to repeat a pattern he could no longer easily categorize. It was no longer possible to frame it as isolated success or temporary attention. The data suggested persistence. Persistence suggested structure. Structure suggested something that would continue whether he observed it or not. He leaned back slightly in his chair, looking toward the window where the city lights now appeared more uniform, less chaotic, almost like a connected system rather than separate movements. The realization forming inside him was not dramatic, but it was steady, that certain outcomes do not remain confined to the moment they are first recognized, they extend forward in ways that gradually reshape perception itself. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, Jessica locked the service window of the food truck and stepped outside into the cooler air of the evening, taking a brief moment to observe the street as it settled into nighttime calm. The day had been long, but not unfamiliar, and she carried no visible sign of the attention surrounding her, only the continuation of routine. Yet behind her, the small space she had built from almost nothing now held a different weight than it had before, no longer just survival, but presence. And as the city continued its constant movement around both of them, one man observing from above and one woman working at ground level, the distance between past assumption and present reality continued to narrow in a way that neither of them could fully ignore, even if only one of them had begun to recognize what it meant. The city had fully transitioned into night, and the lights outside the high-rise office formed a continuous pattern of movement that no longer felt separate or random, but connected in a way that mirrored the growing sense of awareness inside David Anderson's mind. He stood by the window for a long moment without speaking, his reflection faintly layered over the skyline, as if two versions of the same reality were occupying the same space. Inside the office behind him, the environment remained unchanged, the same structured order of glass surfaces, muted lighting, and carefully designed silence that usually reinforced control, yet tonight it felt different, as if the structure itself was no longer providing the same psychological distance it once did. On his desk, multiple screens remained active with financial dashboards, market summaries, and internal communications, but he was no longer interacting with them in a linear way. Instead, his attention drifted between them and something less structured, a pattern that had been building through repeated visibility of Jessica Miller across different platforms and systems throughout the day. It was no longer about a single appearance or even a series of updates, but about the consistency of her presence across unrelated channels, as if separate systems were converging on the same subject without coordination. In Brooklyn, Jessica had already closed the food truck for the night and was walking a short distance down the sidewalk toward a nearby subway entrance, her steps unhurried, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested familiarity with the rhythm of long days followed by quiet endings. The air was cooler now, and the city felt less crowded, but not empty, filled instead with the softer movement of people transitioning between spaces rather than rushing toward them. She paused briefly near a corner where a small group of people were still discussing something on their phones, and she could hear fragments of her own name being mentioned in passing, not directed at her, but carried by the flow of conversation that had formed around her recent visibility. She did not stop or respond, only continued forward, as if the attention existed in a layer parallel to her own experience rather than inside it. Back in the office tower, David finally moved away from the window and returned to his desk, opening a consolidated report that had been prepared by his advisory team summarizing recent consumer behavior trends and emerging brand narratives in urban food services. Jessica Miller's name appeared again, but this time it was accompanied by structured indicators showing sustained engagement growth, repeated media placement, and increasing regional recognition that extended beyond initial viral attention. He read through the data slowly, not because he needed clarification, but because each line reinforced a conclusion that was becoming increasingly difficult to postpone. This was not an isolated development that would fade after initial exposure. It was a trajectory that continued regardless of his awareness. A second notification appeared, this time referencing a scheduled invitation for her to participate in a larger national lifestyle segment focused on independent entrepreneurs reshaping urban food culture. The wording was neutral, professional, and procedural, but its implication extended beyond its tone, suggesting that her presence was becoming structurally embedded within a broader narrative of public attention. David set the device down for a moment and leaned back in his chair, his eyes briefly closing as he processed not the content itself, but the continuity behind it. The realization forming was subtle but persistent, that Jessica was no longer positioned within the periphery of his past, but was now operating in a parallel track of visibility that no longer required his acknowledgement to continue expanding. In Brooklyn, Jessica reached the subway entrance and paused again before descending, the noise of the street fading slightly behind her as she transitioned toward the underground rhythm of the city. She adjusted the strap of her bag and stepped inside, disappearing from the surface level of the city that had been observing her throughout the day without her needing to respond to it directly. Above ground, screens continued to display fragments of her story in news cycles and digital platforms, but below ground, she moved with the same steady consistency she had maintained from the beginning, unaffected by the scale of attention that had grown around her. And in the quiet distance between these two perspectives, one observing from above and one moving through the city below, the gap between perception and reality continued to narrow, not through confrontation, but through the simple accumulation of visibility that could no longer be separated into isolated moments. The night in the city had deepened into a quieter state, but inside David Anderson's office the atmosphere felt increasingly compressed, as if the boundaries between thought and reality were narrowing with each passing minute. The glass walls reflected the skyline in layered fragments of light, but he was no longer observing the city in the same detached way he usually did. Instead, his attention remained fixed on the internal systems in front of him, where data continued to update in real time without pause, carrying traces of the same subject that had followed him throughout the entire day. Jessica Miller's presence, once something he could compartmentalize as a distant memory, had now become a recurring structural element across multiple information streams, and the repetition of her name across independent reports was beginning to form a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. It was not the individual updates that unsettled him, but the consistency of direction they all pointed toward, a steady expansion of visibility that continued without reliance on his acknowledgement. In Brooklyn, Jessica had already returned to her small apartment above a quiet commercial block not far from where she parked her food truck, and she stood by the window for a moment before turning on a small kitchen light, allowing the familiar space to settle around her. The apartment was modest, functional, shaped by necessity rather than design, yet it carried a sense of stability that had been built gradually over time through repetition and discipline. She placed her bag on a chair and began preparing a simple meal for herself, moving through the routine with the same steady pace she maintained throughout her workday, as if separating external recognition from internal rhythm was not an effort but a natural condition. Outside, the city continued its layered motion, distant traffic, scattered voices, the soft hum of infrastructure that never fully stopped, yet none of it seemed to interrupt her focus. Back in the office tower, David opened a consolidated analytics briefing that had been updated within the last hour, and this time the information structure felt more explicit than before. Jessica Miller was no longer listed only under consumer engagement metrics or media coverage summaries, but now appeared within a broader classification of emerging urban entrepreneurs receiving sustained public attention across multiple states, including New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. The report also referenced upcoming media appearances scheduled over the next 2 weeks, including a nationally distributed lifestyle feature that would place her story within a larger narrative of economic resilience and independent business growth. David read through the document slowly, not because it required analysis, but because it forced him to remain inside a reality that was continuing to develop without his input. Each line reinforced a sense of continuity that he could not interrupt, as if the system itself had moved beyond the stage where individual perception determined relevance. At one point, he placed the report aside and leaned back in his chair, staring toward the ceiling for a moment before shifting his gaze back to the city outside, where countless windows reflected similar private moments of thought and reaction. Yet none of those reflections provided clarity, only distance. In Brooklyn, Jessica finished her meal and sat quietly at the small table near the window, where the glow of streetlights filtered through thin curtains, casting soft patterns across the room. She checked her phone briefly, seeing messages from customers who had visited earlier in the day, expressing appreciation for consistency, quality, and the simple familiarity of her presence. She responded politely, briefly, without extending the conversation beyond what was necessary, then set the phone aside again. There was no indication in her behavior that she was responding to the broader attention building around her story, yet that attention continued to grow independently, moving through digital platforms, local news cycles, and scheduled media planning systems. Back in the office tower, David closed the analytics report and allowed a brief moment of stillness to settle over him, but the stillness did not bring resolution. Instead, it highlighted the absence of control he had assumed he maintained over narratives that once felt fixed. Jessica Miller was no longer a reference point anchored in the past, she had become an active trajectory unfolding in real time, one that continued to expand outward while he observed it from a distance he could no longer reduce. And as the city moved through its night cycle, connecting thousands of individual lives through invisible systems of movement and communication, the space between recognition and reality continued to narrow, leaving behind only the quiet understanding that some developments do not conclude when they are ignored, they simply continue until they can no longer be interpreted as anything other than what they have already become. The city had entered a deeper night cycle, where movement outside the windows of David Anderson's office became softer and more distant, yet inside the space where he sat the sense of awareness had sharpened rather than faded. The glass walls reflected layers of light from surrounding buildings, creating an overlapping visual field that made it difficult to separate what was immediate from what was reflected, and that sensation matched the way his thoughts had begun to operate. It was no longer processing information in isolated segments, but in continuity, as if each new update was not separate but part of an ongoing structure that had been forming throughout the entire day. Jessica Miller's name appeared again on his secondary monitor, this time attached to a scheduled media announcement confirming her participation in a nationally broadcast feature focused on independent entrepreneurial growth stories across major American cities. The wording was professional and neutral, yet its repetition across multiple systems made it feel less like information and more like reinforcement of something already in motion. It did not react outwardly, but internally there was a shift that could not be ignored, a recognition that her trajectory was no longer dependent on proximity, memory, or even relevance to his own decisions. It was operating independently, sustained by external attention that continued to expand without requiring validation from his side. In Brooklyn, Jessica had returned to her food truck early the next morning after a brief rest, arriving before the usual rush, when the streets were still partially quiet and the city had not fully transitioned into its daytime rhythm. She unlocked the service window, turned on the interior lights, and began preparing ingredients with the same steady efficiency she had developed over time, moving through each task with familiarity rather than urgency. There was no visible change in her behavior despite the growing attention surrounding her story. The media presence, the customer conversations, and the increasing recognition remained external layers, while her internal rhythm remained focused on execution. A small notice had been delivered earlier that morning confirming final scheduling for a televised feature recording set to take place in the coming days, but she placed it aside without extended focus, as if treating it as part of logistics rather than transformation. Old City, the first customers of the day began to arrive, and the line formed gradually, not with sudden intensity, but with consistent presence that reflected how her visibility had evolved into something stable rather than temporary. Back in the office tower, David reviewed a compiled intelligence summary that now included sentiment analysis from financial media platforms, lifestyle publications, and urban consumer tracking systems. Jessica Miller was no longer categorized solely as a trending subject but as a sustained narrative within independent business coverage, with indicators showing continued expansion across multiple regions. The report noted that engagement levels had stabilized at a high threshold rather than peaking and declining, which suggested structural interest rather than temporary curiosity. Read the line twice, not because he needed clarification, but because it confirmed a pattern that he had already begun to understand without wanting to define it too directly. The implication was no longer about visibility alone. It was about permanence. Later in the day, a scheduled internal meeting briefly interrupted his focus, but even while participating, his attention drifted intermittently toward the unresolved continuity of the information he had been tracking. Colleagues discussed acquisition timelines and projected market adjustments, yet David found himself returning mentally to the same underlying realization that had been forming across multiple days, that Jessica Miller was no longer positioned within the past framework of his life, but had transitioned into an independent trajectory shaped by external systems of attention and validation. In Brooklyn, Jessica completed the morning preparation cycle and briefly stepped outside the food truck to observe the street as it gradually became more active. The environment around her was ordinary, traffic increasing, pedestrians moving with morning purpose, but layered within that ordinariness was a subtle shift that came from repeated recognition. People passing by acknowledged her presence more frequently, some stopping briefly, others simply observing before continuing on. She acknowledged them with the same calm consistency she applied to every interaction, without altering her internal state in response to external perception. And in the distance, across the city skyline where glass towers reflected the movement of thousands of individual routines, the connection between observation and outcome continued to tighten in ways that were no longer dependent on a single point of awareness. For David, that meant watching a narrative he once believed was closed continue to expand beyond the boundaries he had assigned to it, and for Jessica, It meant continuing forward without needing to interpret the scale of what was happening around her. Between those two perspectives, the city moved as a single system, carrying both memory and transformation at the same time. The morning arrived over the city with a calm that felt almost unchanged on the surface, yet beneath that surface everything carried a different weight, as if the structure of perception itself had been subtly rewritten over time without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened. In David Anderson's office, the first light reflected off the glass walls in clean geometric lines, but he did not immediately turn toward the view as he usually did. Instead, he remained seated at his desk, looking at a quiet screen filled with finalized reports and overnight summaries that no longer felt like routine updates, but like confirmations of something already decided beyond his control. Jessica Miller's presence was still there, not as a breaking headline or sudden development, but as a sustained condition embedded across multiple layers of information he now encountered by default. Her scheduled national feature appearance had been confirmed overnight, with production notes indicating broader distribution across streaming platforms and morning broadcast networks, positioning her story within a wider framework of entrepreneurial visibility that extended far beyond local recognition. He read the update slowly, not because it was difficult to understand, but because it reinforced a continuity that no longer aligned with how he had once categorized her life. There was no longer a point where her trajectory could be paused, minimized, or mentally set aside as temporary. It had become self-sustaining, supported by external systems that operated independently of his attention. In Brooklyn, Jessica arrived at her food truck early, as she had done every day prior, unlocking the service window and preparing the interior space with quiet precision. The street outside was beginning to fill with morning activity, but inside her focus remained steady on preparation rather than perception. A small production team had been scheduled to film part of her routine for the upcoming feature, yet their presence did not alter her movements in any noticeable way. She continued organizing ingredients, checking supplies, and preparing for the day with the same consistent rhythm that had defined her work since the beginning of her rebuild. When the crew briefly introduced themselves and explained timing adjustments, she responded politely, then returned immediately to her tasks, as if integration into a larger narrative did not require emotional adjustment. Back in the office tower, David attended a scheduled executive briefing, where the discussion centered on portfolio performance and upcoming strategic positioning across several market sectors. The conversation flowed in structured terms, yet his attention intermittently drifted toward internal notifications that continued to surface references to Jessica Miller across unrelated systems, including lifestyle media scheduling, audience engagement projections, and regional growth tracking reports. Each mention was consistent in tone and format, reinforcing the same underlying message of sustained visibility. At one point, a colleague commented on shifting consumer interest toward independent food brands in metropolitan areas, referencing Jessica's story as an example of emerging cultural relevance. The remark was casual, almost incidental, but it carried an impact that was not fully visible in the room, because it connected public narrative to private recognition in a way that could no longer be easily separated. David did not respond immediately. Instead, he simply nodded, maintaining composure while internally processing the convergence of information that had now extended beyond his personal observation into collective acknowledgement. After the meeting ended, he returned to his office and stood once again near the window, looking down at the city where movement continued without interruption. The realization that had been forming across previous days had now reached a quieter clarity, that Jessica Miller's story was no longer contained within memory, media cycles, or isolated success moments. It had become part of a continuing system of visibility that expanded regardless of his engagement. In Brooklyn, filming began as scheduled, capturing Jessica's routine with minimal disruption, focusing on the flow of her work rather than staged presentation. She moved through each task naturally, speaking only when asked direct questions, her responses measured and grounded in lived experience rather than performance. The presence of cameras did not alter her internal rhythm, and that consistency became part of what the production team observed most closely. As the day continued in parallel across different parts of the city, one man observing from structured distance and one woman operating within steady repetition, the space between perception and reality continued to narrow, not through confrontation or revelation, but through accumulation, until what was once seen as distant had become unmistakably present in every layer of the world around them.